can chase people off to the side of the road. And she used to tell me stories about it chasing my great uncles and them talking about coming over the turnstiles and the fences, and that it would come jump the fence when they was going over the turnstiles. And that it had chased the dogs. The dogs would all run up under the porches and just sit and cower and cry and want to come in the house and things. And that everybody, as soon as they heard it was coming, would go shut all the doors and windows and lock them. Hi everyone, I'm Brad Walker. We're here at Magness Library, and most of you know me as the genealogist and historian, and we're going to talk about some of the tales in the Warren County and the surrounding counties, and just some interesting things. Hang around because the tall tales are coming.
Welcome to another edition of Community Insider. Join us as we travel Middle Tennessee, uncovering history and experiencing the adventure of unique stories and events coming to you inside your community.
One of my favorite tales is the ones that my mother used to tell us all the time, and anybody that lives up through Irving College and up into Grundy County along Tarleton and that way will know this. Some of you out at Jacksboro and stuff talk about something very similar. It's called the White Thing, and it was a not quite ghost, not quite animal. There's still tales of it today. The kind of interesting things is that through the years doing research in different books, talking with different people, I have actually come across accounts that go all the way back to the early 1800s in a newspaper article. Then I found a reference in the Civil War in the valley, right in the top of Tarleton Valley at the foot of the mountain, at my great-great-grandparents' place, the Morton House. And it has went through the years, and my mother used to sit when I was little and tell us the stories, and I've heard my grandmother and my great-grandmother all sit and tell us the stories. So I'm just going to kind of start where I started with it, and that's in 1974-5. A lot of people will remember there was a lot of bad floods here. The tornado came through and killed several people, and we had the snowstorms. Well, we had really horrible storms, lightning and stuff, and I came from a big family, and my mother came from a big family, so she was raised kind of by her grandmother a lot at the foot of the mountain, and she had polio as a child, so she was always around the older people, and they would tell the stories and tales. And the story was that there's a white thing that lives up through the valley. And the stories my mother told, I never heard of it hurting anyone. It would do damage to property, break fences, might kill animals, but it never hurt anyone, and the dogs were terrified of it. Just literally would hide under the porch, crying and refused to go out. But on this dark night, my father was at work in one of the factories here in town, and my mother, she did not like lightning really much, so the flood waters had started rising. So she decided we're going to my great-grandmother's house at the foot of Tarleton, at the head of Tarleton Valley. It's right before you cross the bridge on the right in front of the old Tate and Dykes nursery building there. All that's left now is the well. And so we get there, Mama has 6 kids. My Uncle Ricky shows up and he's got his oldest son that's my age. And my Uncle Bill showed up, and my great-grandmother had 3 big feather beds in the side room like a lot of old people did. And they're these really large, big beds. So I went to sleep at about 10 o'clock at night, and the storm raging outside. And the next morning I wake up and I'm in bed, instead of being in the bed with my siblings and my mother, I'm in bed with my aunt, uncle, and my cousin. And I'm like, why did everybody move beds in the middle of the night? And during the middle of the night, in the height of the storm and the floodwaters coming down the mountain, they said it come down the little valley that runs back behind there. Catty corner, it's on the right from the main road where it turns to go up the mountain. On the right, there's a little valley that goes up. And they said that it came down that valley, you could hear it, and it sounded just like a woman screaming. And it went right up one side of the house, right over the top of the house, and right off the other side and on down into the valley, screaming the whole time. And I know a lot of you's going, oh, that's a bobcat or something like that. Except everybody got up in the middle of the night. My uncles are all hunters. They hunted coon. Anything that was up there, they was a-hunting. And they never could find it. And so that was kind of where I started asking questions about all this and where it came from, because they was all talking about the white thing. And I'd heard my mother talk about it before. So the story went that there's this creature that had been there for years and years and years, and nobody knows exactly what it is. And it was seen often, usually in dusk or early morning a lot of times, from the stories my mother told and some of the other people I've heard. And it would often pace people off to the side of the road. And she used to tell me stories about it chasing my great uncles and them talking about coming over the turnstiles and the fences, and that it would come jump the fence when they was going over the turnstiles. And that it had chased the dogs. The dogs would all run up under the porches and just sit and cower and cry and want to come in the house and things. And that everybody, as soon as they heard it was coming, would go shut all the doors and windows and lock them. Well, the interesting thing was that whenever I started looking into this, through the years I've read a lot of the papers, all the old newspapers and different things. And I found in an 1820 or 30 newspaper an article about it, that during the middle of the night, everybody thought a woman was being murdered in the Gulf right up above this place. And everything they talked about fit exactly what the stories I'd always heard was. During the Civil War, in the official compendium of the rebellion, there is a record of a group being camped right behind my great-great-grandparents' place, the Wid Morton place, that used to be there on the right. And they talk about during the middle of the night there was a large storm raging. And during the middle of the night they heard something coming down through the woods, crashing through the woods, screaming at the top of its lungs like a woman. It went right through the center of the camp and scattered the group right through the fire and run on down the valley. In the article I found in the Grundy County papers in the 1890s, there is an account of everyone thinking something was in the top of the valley hunting people because they could hear women screaming in the woods. And it was always at the time that these storms was coming through. Well, whenever I was a teenager, I went to a place that's back behind Tarleton Church. It's called the Blue Cliff. And when you go back there, and part of the bluff line has all collapsed around it, but you can walk up and there's a cave. It's just a break in a wall the size of a door, and it's completely bare, tread down, red clay, And you can hear the river running underground there. A lot of people don't know Collins River, that the wash, what people call the wash there behind Tarleton and all that, the river actually runs underground underneath it and comes out at the Big Spring over in Gross's Cove. And when I was there, I realized whatever had been going in and out of this cave, it was hitting 5 to 6 feet at the shoulder, because you could see where something had been going in and out of the cave that was at least that tall. There were no human footprints there, and there is no path to get to that. You have to climb over boulders and everything to get over there, so it's animals going in and out. But all my life I had heard stories about this creature. And one time, I was probably 11, 12 years old. We had been going up the valley. My grandmother lives right as you cross the Grundy County line. My grandparents did. My great-grandmother lives 7 miles up past there at the head of Tarleton. We was going up through there, and it was me, my mother, my little sister, Michelle, and we were going to pick my brother up at my great-grandmother's house. My great-grandmother, her name was Bessie Tate, and when we crossed the bridge, we realized there was something running in the woods on the opposite side from us, and you could see it because it was late winter, so there was no leaves, and it was white as snow, and it followed us for almost 3 miles, and Mama was doing about 50 miles an hour up that road trying to get away from whatever it was, but you could see it just plain as day, and she actually called our father to come and drive the car back. We'd bring my older brother to drive the car back because she wouldn't drive it because she wouldn't leave the house, my great-grandmother's house. It was very, and I actually saw this, and to this day, and I have studied every animal in the books. I could not tell you to this day what that was, and it was not a reflection because it was snow white, whatever it was, and there was no sun in the sky at that time or moon. So there was nothing that could be reflecting off of it. And it's just one of those weird tall tales that I know many people that'll tell you they've seen it, they've heard it, they know that it's been through, they find where things have been broke. Occasionally an animal will disappear, but it's funny that there are records that go back in that little section of the valley that I have actually found in official records and things at different times that pinpoint that, and they all say the same thing. There's something that every time a storm comes through, something comes down out of that wash that is a good-sized animal, it disappears, and it's white. So that's the story, folks.
Now, tell us about your picture.
Which
Tell us
one?
about
This
the
one?
painting here. Yeah.
Do you want me to leave it there?
Yeah.
This is actually my great-grandmother's, Bessie Morton Tate. This is her home. If any of you are familiar, when you go up through Grundy County to Beersheba Springs, on the right, there's the old green building that was the Tate and Dykes Nursery, right as you cross the little bridge. Her house actually sat right at the end of that, and the little well is still sitting there. And this is the house that the creature went over. The gulf that it come down is actually sitting, if you're looking at the picture, it's in the back right corner. And that is where it come down the gulf. The wash runs all the way down the backside of her house. So it had to have crossed the water to get there. And her parents' house actually sits back farther on the other side of the wash. The Witt and Mighty Morton place was a big log, a 4-room log cabin that sat back there that was tore down in the late 70s. And that is actually where it come right through over the top and was about where part of that stuff happened during the Civil War. It would have been right behind that old cabin there. Because my grandmother used to talk about how people would talk about the white thing coming down through there, and you shouldn't be out real late at night and stuff because nobody, even though I never heard an instance of it hurting anybody, everybody was really scared of it because apparently it was interested in humans, whatever it is. Be it a big bobcat, a mountain lion. If it's a mountain lion, it's got to be an albino. And I can't imagine mountain lions lasting that long in an area like this and somebody not seeing them. because they need a lot of hunting. But Granny lived there all of her life, either right there or at the house behind it. And
The picture that you have in the book there, who's that of?
this one, this is Wid and Mighty. This is my great-great-grandparents, her parents. This is William Wid Morton and Elmira, and they called her Little Mighty Morton. She was a Dykes. And the property there, all that property on the right as you come down the mountain or go up the mountain to the right of the mountain was part of the Dugan place, and it was her mother's family.
Okay.
And when they got married, they lived in the cabin for a while with her parents. My great-grandmother did. I have a picture, well, but they were, I never knew these people, but I have a lot of the family pictures and stuff from talking to people, and I gather a lot of the stories from different branches of the family. And it's always funny that all you have to do is mention the white thing and they'll instantly perk up and say, do you know the stories? Because it is very common up the valley. And out in Jacksboro area and Pocahontas and out in there, they have something very similar that's called the Screaming Jack. And the Screaming Jack is pretty well known all over the south and upper northern side of the country. It was kind of a creature that run on two legs. It used to attract humans and it's one of the crypto creatures. It is considered a crypto creature now. It is one of the creatures that there's a lot of evidence of people talking about that goes back into time, but they don't have any good physical evidence, although there are lots of newspaper articles about screaming jacks coming through and people being terrified. You see a lot of stuff about crypto animals now. It's very popular. I read a lot of books about it. But all the stories that I've heard, the people that tell you these stories about these creatures, the older people, they are very earnest. They are not trying to pull your leg. They're not telling you the big stories about the wampus cat and some of the other creatures that people talk about around here. The white thing was one of those things that you can tell when you're talking to some of them, they saw something, because the reaction you get from them physically, as well as the way they light up, that you know what they're talking about, is kind of amazing to watch. Some of the things you can do when you're researching things like this, as a genealogist and a historian, one of the best sources when people tell you people's names and you're hunting things like that, we have cemetery books, we have the local history books, we have the newspapers. All of these things are great sources for trying to find out about odd things in the county, find out about your house. We have a lot of people coming in now who's wanting to know about their houses, who lived there before them, had somebody died in the house. I actually did a little bit of the research for the 2 ghost stories that came here, for the 2 houses that were haunted. We helped do some of that research, the people here. And it was very interesting because it was amazing some of the history that we did find and how far we could go back on the history of some of the houses here in McMinnville. And if you're out in the country, outside of town 4 or 5 miles, one of the best things you can do is go talk to some of the older people in the community. And people have a bad habit of not liking to listen to older people. I have always been fascinated because they can tell you more about the pieces of property within 5 miles of them than you can dig in 2 months out of books, because they lived there their whole lives, they have heard the stories, they've been parts of the stories, and they are amazing for knowing the things. And if nothing else, it gives you the leads you need to then go start finding the actual sources that you need for information and how to dig. You can come up. Cheryl is here in the genealogy room. We also have the Warren County Genealogical and Historical Society. Me and Cheryl are both members of it. We do a lot of work finding out history. We did a history in almost every single journal has some history of a building or something in it anymore. Cemeteries. The genealogical group has actually found a lot of lost cemeteries. It's one of the projects they're working on, because there's a lot of them on people's properties that people don't realize. There's just 1 or 2 tombstones there that fell over, and you come across them when you're clearing something out. A lot of family properties, you can find them, you can go and talk. Don't just talk to the older people in your family if it's an older property, like my family's in Grundy County. Talk to their cousins, because their families grew up there too, and they may have slightly different stories to the stories you know. And always remember that before the 40s, up into the mid-40s, about 43, there was the gossip pieces for every single community in Warren County that goes back to the 1880s. And it's amazing some of the things you find in that. One of my favorite stories that I would have thought was a tall tale if somebody had told me was, I found in one of those little things where my great-grandparents, the Wanamaker's, they pulled up to the porch in a carriage in I think it's 1911, and were married. The preacher walked out on the porch, Reverend Killian walked out on the porch, married them in the buggy, and they drove off and never got out of the buggy. And I actually found that, and when I asked my great aunt, the 2 great aunts that were still alive at the time, neither one of them knew that about their own parents, that their parents got married by pulling up to the Reverend's porch. He walked out on the porch and married them, and it was in that little gossip column. So you can find amazing things like that. I found one of the ones where they took my mother in 43 or 4. One of the neighbors was taking her to Nashville to have her treatments for polio. It's just a line that I think it was Mr. Scruggs had took her in the car, and she was 3.5 years old, and she was having some of the first surgeries on her leg to stretch the tendons, and dropped her off down there because families, they couldn't leave the rest of the kids. So there's some interesting things that you come across in those old columns like that about your family that you never knew, because it's the everyday stuff that they don't remember and nobody talks about a lot of time. But we have a huge set of resources here. The genealogical group is a huge resource. There is just a lot of things you can find out. But older people has always been one of my favorite sources, because they can tell you wonderful stories. They often don't care if you record them. And it's just amazing the history that they give without ever realizing that's what they're doing. And nowadays, that's kind of becoming no longer a thing because people tend to move a lot. So we're losing history daily as these older people die, because there's nobody that's still on those properties. They're becoming large farms or large timber areas, and all of that history is dying because there's nobody it's being passed to. The mummy's hand is an interesting artifact. I actually was brought up here when I was in 3rd grade. They walked us from William Biles School uptown along the side of the road, and they used to bring us and they would take us to the fire hall that was below the library here. Then they brought us to the library, and the library had laid out all of the guns and Civil War swords, but they also had the mummy's hand, which is just an amazing relic. And through the years, I have found some of the newspaper articles and different things regarding it. It has managed to survive, and Mr. Magness, who built the library, the upstairs was kind of going to be an apartment for him. And he was using it, he had a study and a parlor. But when he was in McMinnville, he tended to stay with his sister and his niece. And Mr. Magness, in and of himself, was a world traveler. A lot of people don't know that we had people like this in McMinnville. Mr. Magness traveled all over Europe, the Middle East. He was there during the teens and 20s and literally traveled all over that part of the world. He'd been all over Europe, most of the upper part of Africa and different places. He lived in Syria and Egypt for almost 5 years. And he went on 3 grand tours. And for the younger people that don't know what the grand tour was, the grand tour was where people would go a lot of times either right during college or right after, and they would tour parts of the world. And a lot of times it was Europe, different parts of Europe, and there was a set path that they would take up through Europe. Mr. Magness was there at least 3 times that we know of, according to the histories and different things. But it's one of the reasons the library facade actually looks like it does, is because he fell in love with Carnegie libraries, and he wanted this building to have the look and feel of a Carnegie library. But while he was on one of these travels in Syria and Egypt, he apparently bought a mummy's hand. And we had the lady who come and authenticated it is an actual mummy's hand. And the story that I was told by his great niece when she was in her 90s, right after I came to work here, she toured the building. She lived in Nashville at the time. And she told me, she saw it in the hall. We have it in a big display case upstairs. And she saw it, and she says, oh, I remember that. She said, right after Mr. Magness died, he stayed with us part of the time. And said, this box, you can't see it real well, but this box went in years ago, was a real pretty teal with a gold leaf motif on it. It was a beautiful little box. And she said, my mother went into the study where he worked a lot of times in our house. And he would use the big desk in there. So he would often bring his sister presents. So she found this little box, and it had a yellow silk ribbon that was tied around it for years. And she found it just shortly after he died in this desk, and she thought it was a present he had forgot to give her. So she had pulled the study doors too. It had the sliding doors, the pocket doors. And she had pulled them too. And the girl was upstairs, and she said, all of a sudden I heard Mother scream just at the top of her lungs. And said, we all go running downstairs. And she's sitting there by the desk shaking, saying, take it out, take it out, take it out. And the next day it came to the library. And that's how the library ended up with it, and how we know that it is authentic and has been in the library. It's been with us since 1936. And we have the newspaper articles when it was given to the library, actually. It's on the back of the box. And you would not believe how many people come in and say, do you still have the mummy's hand? That grew up here and have left, and they bring their kids back to show their kids or grandkids the mummy's hand. And a lot of times if they'll tell me one of the groups is coming from one of the schools, I will get it out just to show them. And I always get it out. Yeah, I remember very well them walking us here. They took us into the bank vault and told us if we could pick up the bag of pennies, we could walk off with it and let us try. But it was something they used to do around town a lot.
A lot of people in the Middle Tennessee area has some of those big stories. We found out some of them to be true, some of them to be false, and of course that's what we're trying to investigate right here on Community Insider Tall Tales.